Welcome, traveler, to my first story reading. This is going to be one of the first of hopefully a few. I want this to be for people who enjoy stories, listening to stories being told, people who struggle to fall asleep. Hopefully my voice can help you do that. I'm going to be talking close to the microphone, so the video is a little bit in a different place. If you like ASMR, let's not get weird, but I think we all secretly like a little bit of that. So I've decided to read a short story. It's still long, but if people like it, I'll continue doing short stories, maybe reading longer pieces. Obviously, I want to keep them to fantasy. This is meant to be a fantasy channel. So today I'm going to be starting with Fortress Unvanquishable, save for Sacnoth, a short story by Lord Dunsany. I've never read any of his stuff. I haven't read this story either, but we'll explore it together. When I make mistakes, I'll be able to edit it. Otherwise, if you do like this video, some of the other stories I would like to read include The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. But again, I have to be reading these in the public domain. I really wanted to read a lot of different kinds of books, ones that I really enjoyed, even reading excerpts. I've done some research. You can't do that. Some people have uploaded The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. I'm not sure how they get away with it. So other stories that I've researched that are on the public domain include Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. I am going to be doing The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I love that poem. It's quite long, and but it might not be super relaxing because it's got quite a beat to it. Some of the other ones that I've been looking at, which are actually quite long. One of my favorite stories is The Epic of Gilgamesh. I have to find a proper version that I can read. Beowulf as well, going back to the ancient classics. But on top of that, I'm looking at potentially Dracula, some short stories by Edgar Allan Poe, maybe even H.P. Lovecraft. Doesn't quite fit into the high fantasy. Me being a fantasy snob, I like my fantasy a specific way, and if it doesn't fit into epic or high fantasy, I start to frown. Obviously I like grimdark and low fantasy, but any sort of portal fantasy I get a bit iffy about. But being a lover of all fantasy, these ones fit the bill. Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz. Potentially I might even do a little bit of sci-fi. The Time Machine is a really good one. It's short. I love that story too. So if you have any recommendations, post a comment. I'm going to try and have the options down below that maybe you can vote for them, or not sure. Anyway, let us begin with Fortress Unvanquishable, save for Sacnoth by Lord Dunsany. In a wood older than record, a foster brother of the hills, stood the village of Alathurian, and there was peace between the people of that village and all folk who walked in the dark ways of the wood, whether they were human or of the tribes of the beast, or of the race of the fairies and the elves and the little sacred spirits of trees and streams. Moreover, the village people had peace among themselves, and between them and their lord, Lorendiak. In front of the village was a wide and grassy space, and beyond this the great wood again, but at the back of the trees came right up to the houses, which, with their great beams and wooden framework and thatched roofs, green with moss, seemed almost to be a part of the forest. Now in the time I tell of, there was trouble in Alathurian, For of an evening fell dreams were wont to come slipping through the tree trunks and into the peaceful village, and they assumed dominion of men's minds and led them in watches of the night through the cindery plains of hell. Then the magician of that village made spells against those fell dreams, yet still in the dreams came flitting through the trees as soon as the dark had fallen, and led men's minds by night into terrible places, and caused them to praise Satan openly with their lips. And men grew afraid of sleep in Alathurian, and they grew worn and pale, some through the want of rest, and others from fear of the things they saw in the cindery plains of hell. Then the magician of the village went up into the tower of his house, and all night long those whom fear kept awake could see his window high up in the night glowing softly alone. The next day, when the twilight was far gone, and the night was gathering fast, the magician went away to the forest's edge, and uttered there the spell that he had made. And the spell was a compulsive, terrible thing, having a power over evil dreams and over spirits of ill, for it was a verse of 40 lines in many languages, both living and dead, and had in it the word wherewith the people of the plains are wont to curse their camels, and the shouts wherewith the whalers of the north lure the whales shoreward to be killed, and a word that caused elephants to trumpet, and every one of the 40 lines closed with a rhyme for wasp. And still the dreams came flitting through the forest, and led the men's souls into the plains of hell. Then the magician knew that the dreams were from Gaznak. Therefore he gathered the people of the village, and told them that he had uttered his mightiest spell, a spell having power over all that were human or of the tribe of the beasts. And since it had not availed, the dreams must come from Gaznak, the greatest magician among the space of the stars. And he read to the people out of the Book of Magicians, which tells the coming of the comet and foretells his coming again. And he told them how Gaznak rides upon the comet, and how he visits Earth once in every 230 years, and makes for himself a vast, invincible fortress, and sends out dreams to feed on the minds of men, and may never be vanquished, but by the sword Sacnoth. Then spake Leothric, son of the Lord Lorendiak, and 20 years old he was. Good master, what of the sword Sacnoth? And the village magician answered, Fair lord, no such sword as yet is wrought, for it lies as yet in the hide of Tharagaverug, protecting his spine. Then said Leothric, Who is Tharagaverug, and where may he be encountered? And the magician of Alathurian answered, He is the dragon crocodile, who haunts the northern marshes, and ravages the homesteads by their marge, and the hide of his back is of steel, and his underparts are of iron, but along the midst of his back, over his spine, there lies a narrow strip of unearthly steel. This strip of steel is Sacnoth, and it may be neither cleft nor molten, and there is nothing in the world that may avail to break it, nor even leave a scratch upon its surface. It is of the length of a good sword, and of the breadth thereof. Shouldst thou prevail against Tharagaverug, his hide may be melted away from Sacnoth in a furnace, but there is only one thing that may sharpen Sacnoth's edge, and this is one of Tharagaverug's own steel eyes. And the other eye thou must fasten to Sacnoth's hilt, and it will watch for thee. But it is a hard task to vanquish Tharagaverug, for no sword can pierce his hide, his back cannot be broken, and he can neither burn nor drown. In one way only can Tharagaverug die, and that is by starving. Then sorrow fell upon Leothric, but the magician spoke on. If a man drive Tharagaverug away from his food with a stick for 3 days, he will starve on the 3rd day at sunset. And though he is not vulnerable, yet in one spot he may take hurt, for his nose is already of lead. A sword would merely lay bare the uncleavable bronze beneath, but if his nose were smitten constantly with a stick, he will always recoil from the pain, and thus may Tharagaverug to the left and right be driven away from his food. Then Leothric said, "What is Tharagaverug's food?" And the magician of Alathurian said, "His food is men." But Leothric was straightway thence, and cut a great staff from a hazel tree, and slept early that evening. But the next morning, awaking from troubled dreams, he arose before the dawn, and taking with him provisions for 5 days, set out through the forest northward towards the marshes. For some hours he moved through the gloom of the forest, and when he emerged from it, the sun was above the horizon, shining on pools of water in the wasteland. Presently he saw the claw marks of Tharagaverug deep in the soil, and the track of his tail between them like a furrow in a field. Then Leothric followed the tracks till he heard the bronze heart of Tharagaverug before him, booming like a bell. And Tharagaverug, it being the hour when he took the first meal of the day, was moving towards a village with his heart tolling. And all the people of the village were come out to meet him, as it was their wont to do. For they abode not the suspense of awaiting Tharagaverug, and of hearing him sniffing brazenly as he went from door to door, pondering slowly in his metal mind what habitant he should choose. And none dared to flee, for in the days when the villagers fled from Tharagaverug, he, having chosen his victim, would track him tirelessly like doom. Nothing availed them against Tharagaverug. Once they climbed the trees when he came, but Tharagaverug went up to one, arching his back and leaning over slightly, and rasped against the trunk until it fell. And when Leothric came near, Tharagaverug saw him out of one of his small steel eyes, and came towards him leisurely, and the echoes of his heart swirled up through his open mouth. And Leothric stepped aside from his onset, and came between him and the village, and smote him on the nose, and the blow of the stick made a dint in the soft lead. And Tharagaverug swung clumsily away, uttering one fearful cry like the sound of a great church bell that had become possessed of a sound that fluttered upward from the tombs at night, an evil soul giving the bell a voice. Then he attacked Leothric, snarling, and again Leothric leapt aside, and smote him on the nose with his stick. Tharagaverug uttered like a bell, howling. And whenever the dragon crocodile attacked him, or turned towards the village, Leothric smote him again. So all day long Leothric drove the monster with the stick, and he drove him further and further from his prey, with his heart tolling angrily and his voice crying out from pain. Towards evening Tharagaverug ceased to snap at Leothric, but ran before him to avoid the stick, for his nose was sore and shining. And in the gloaming the villagers came out and danced to cymbal and psaltery. When Tharagaverug heard the cymbal and psaltery, hunger and anger came upon him, and he felt as some lord might feel who was held by force from the banquet in his own castle, and heard the creaking spit go round and round, and the good meat crackling on it. And all that night he attacked Leothric fiercely, and ofttimes nearly caught him in the darkness, for his gleaming eyes of steel could see as well by night as by day. And Leothric gave ground slowly till the dawn, and when the light came they were near the village again, yet not so near to it as they had been when they encountered, for Leothric drove Tharagaverug further in the day than Tharagaverug had forced him back in the night. Then Leothric drove him again with a stick until the hour came when it was the custom of the dragon crocodile to find his man. 1/3 of his man he would eat at a time he found him, and the rest at noon and evening. But when the hour came for finding his man, a great fierceness came on Tharagaverug, and he grabbed rapidly at Leothric, but could not seize him, and for a long while neither of them would retire. But at last the pain of the stick on his leaden nose overcame the hunger of the dragon crocodile, and he turned from it howling. From that moment Tharageverug weakened. All that day Leothric drove him with his stick, and at night both held their ground. And when the dawn of the third day was come, the heart of Tharageverug beat slower and fainter. It was as though a tired man was ringing a bell. Once Tharageverug nearly seized a frog, but Leothric snatched it away just in time. Towards noon the dragon crocodile lay still for a long while, and Leothric stood near him and leaned on his trusty stick. He was very tired and sleepless, but he had more leisure now for eating his provisions. With Tharageverug the end was coming fast, and in the afternoon his breath came hoarsely, rasping in his throat. It was as the sound of many huntsmen blowing blasts of horns, and towards evening his breath came faster but fainter, like the sound of a hunt going furious to the distance and dying away. And he made desperate rushes towards the village, but Leothric still leapt about him, battering his leaden nose. Scarce audible now at all was the sound of his heart. It was like a church bell tolling beyond the hills for the death of someone unknown and far away. Then the sun set and flamed in the village windows, and the chill went over the world, and in some small garden a woman sang, and Tharageverug lifted up his head and starved, and his life went from his invulnerable body, and Leothric lay down beside him and slept. And later in the starlight the villagers came out and carried Leothric sleeping to the village, all praising him in whispers as they went. They lay him down upon a couch in a house, and danced outside in silence, without upholstery or cymbal. And the next day, rejoicing, to Alathurion they hauled the dragon crocodile, and Leothric went with them, holding his battered staff. And a tall broad man, who was smith of Alathurion, made a great furnace, and melted Tharageverug away until only Sacnoth was left, gleaming among the ashes. Then he took one of the small eyes that had been chiselled out, and filed an edge on Sacnoth. But ere it was quite gone, it had sharpened redoubtably Sacnoth. But the other eye they set in the butt of the hilt, and it gleamed there bluely. And that night Leothric arose in the dark and took the sword, and went westward to find Gaznak. And he went through the dark forest till the dawn, and all the morning until the afternoon. But in the afternoon he came into the open, and saw in the midst of the land where no man goeth, the fortress of Gaznak, mountainous before him, little more than a mile away. Leothric saw that the land was marsh and desolate, and the forest went up all white out of it, with many buttresses, and was broad below, but narrowed higher up, and was full of gleaming windows with the light upon them. And near the top of it a few white clouds were floating, but above them some of its pinnacles reappeared. Then Leothric advanced into the marshes, and the eye of Tharageverug looked out warily from the hilt of Sacnoth. For Tharageverug had known the marshes well, and the sword nudged Leothric to the right, or pulled him to the left, away from the dangerous places, and so brought him safely to the fortress walls. And in the walls stood doors, like precipices of steel, all studded with boulders of iron, and above every window were terrible gargoyles of stone, and the names of the fortress shone on the wall, writ large in letters of brass: the Fortress Unvanquishable, save for Sacnoth. Then Leothric drew and revealed Sacnoth, and all the gargoyles grinned, and the grin went flickering from face to face right up into the cloud-abiding gables. And when Sacnoth was revealed and all the gargoyles grinned, it was like the moonlight emerging from the cloud to look for the first time upon a field of blood, and passing swiftly over the wet faces of the slain that lie together in the horrible night. Then Leothric advanced towards a door, and it was mightier than the marble quarry, Sacramona, from which of old men cut enormous slabs to build the Abbey of the Holy Tears. Day after day they wrenched out the very ribs of the hill until the abbey was builded, and it was more beautiful than anything in stone. Then the priests blessed Sacramona, and it had rest. And no more stone was ever taken from it to build the houses of men. And the hill stood looking southward lonely in the sunlight, defaced by that mighty scar. So vast was the door of steel, and the name of the door was the port resonant, the way of egress for war. Then Leothric smote upon the port resonant with Sacnoth, and the echo of Sacnoth went ringing through the halls, and all the dragons in the fortress barked. And when the baying of the remotest dragon had faintly joined in the tumult, a window opened far up among the clouds below the twilight gables, and a woman screamed, and far away in hell her father heard her, and knew that her doom was come. Leothric went on smiting terribly with Sacnoth, and the grey steel of port resonant, the way of egress for war, that was tempered to resist the sword of the world, came away in ringing slices. Then Leothric, holding Sacnoth in his hand, went in through the hole that he had hewn in the door, and came into the unlit cavernous hall. An elephant fled trumpeting, and Leothric stood still, holding Sacnoth. When the sound of the feet of the elephant had died away in the remoter corridors, nothing more stirred, and the cavernous hall was still. Presently the darkness of the distant halls became musical with the sound of bells, all coming nearer and nearer. Still Leothric waited in the dark, and the bell rang louder and louder, echoing through the halls, and there appeared a procession of men on camels riding 2 by 2 from the interior of the fortress, and they were armed with scimitars of Assyrian make, and were all clad with mail, and chain mail hung from their helmets about their faces, and flapped as the camels moved. And they all halted before Leothric in the cavernous hall, and the camel bells clanged and stopped. And the leader said to Leothric, "The Lord Ghaznac has desired to see you die before him. Be pleased to come with us, and we can discourse by the way of the manner in which the Lord Ghaznac has desired to see you die." And as he said this, he unwound a chain of iron that was coiled about his saddle, and Leothric answered, "I would fain go with you, for I am come to slay Ghaznac." Then all the camel guard of Ghaznac laughed hideously, disturbing the vampires that were asleep in the measureless vaults of the roof. And the leader said, "The Lord Ghaznac is immortal, save for Sacnoth, and weareth armour that is proof even against Sacnoth himself, and has a sword the second most terrible in the world." Then Leothric said, "I am the lord of the sword Sacnoth." And he advanced towards the camel guard of Ghaznac, and Sacnoth lifted up and down in his hand as though stirred by the exultant pulse. Then the camel guard of Ghaznac fled, and the riders leaned forward and smote their camels with whips, and they went away with a great clamour of bells through the colonnades and corridors and vaulted halls, and scattered into the inner darkness of the fortress. When the last sound of them had died away, Leothric was in doubt which way to go, for the camel guard had dispersed in many directions, so he went straight on till he came to a great stairway in the midst of the hall. Then Leothric set his foot in the middle of a wide step, and climbed steadily up the stairway for 5 minutes. Little light was there in the great hall through which Leothric ascended, for it only entered through arrow slits here and there, and in the world outside evening was waning fast. The stairway led up to 2 folding doors, and they stood a little ajar, and through the crack Leothric entered and tried to continue straight on, but could get no further, for the room seemed to be full of festoons of ropes which swung from wall to wall and were looped and draped from the ceiling. The whole chamber was thick and black with them. They were soft and light to the touch, like fine silk, but Leothric was unable to break any of them, and though they swung away from him as he pressed forward, yet by the time he had gone 3 yards they were all about him, like a heavy cloak. Then Leothric stepped back and drew Sacnoth, and Sacnoth divided the ropes without a sound, and without a sound the 7 pieces fell to the floor. Leothric went forward slowly, moving Sacnoth in front of him up and down as he went. When he was come into the middle of the chamber, suddenly, as he parted with Sacnoth a great hammock of strands, he saw a spider before him that was larger than a ram, and the spider looked at him with eyes that were little, but in which there was much sin, and said, "Who are you that spoil the labour of years all done to the honour of Satan?" And Leothric answered, "I am Leothric, son of Larendiac." And the spider said, "I will make a rope at once to hang you with." Then Leondric parted another bunch of strands and came nearer to the spider as he sat making with rope. And the spider, looking up from his work, said, "What is that sword which is able to sever my ropes?" And Leothric said, "It is Sacnoth." Whereat the black hair that hung over the face of the spider parted to the left and right, and the spider frowned, and then the hair fell back into its place, and hid everything except the sin of the little eyes, which went on gleaming lustfully in the dark. But before Leothric could reach him, he climbed away with his hands, going up by one of his ropes to a lofty rafter, and there sat growling. But clearing his way with Sacnoth, Leothric passed through the chamber, and came to the further door. And the door being shut, the handle far up out of his reach, he hewed his way through it with Sacnoth in the same way as he had through the port resonant, the way of egress for war. And so Leothric came into the well-lit chamber, where queens and princes were banqueting together, all at a great table, and thousands of candles were glowing all about, and their light shone in the wine that the princes drank, and on the huge gold candelabra. And the royal faces were irradiant with the glow, and the white tablecloth, and the silver plates, and the jewels in the hair of the queens, each jewel having a historian all to itself, who wrote no other chronicles all his days. Between the table and the door there stood 200 footmen in 2 rows of 100 facing one another. Nobody looked at Leothric as he entered through the hole in the door, but one of the princes asked a question of a footman, and the question was passed from mouth to mouth by all the 100 footmen, till it came to the last one nearest Leothric. And he said to Leothric without looking at him, "What do you seek here?" And Leothric answered, "I seek to slay Ghaznad." And the footman to footman repeated all the way to the table, "He seeks to slay Ghaznad." And another question came down the line of footmen, "What is your name?" And the line that stood opposite took his answer back. Then one of the princes said, "Take him away, where we shall not hear his screams." And footmen repeated it to the footmen till it came to the 2 last, and they advanced to seize Leothric. Then Leothric showed to them his sword, saying, "This is Sacnoth." And both of them said to the man nearest, "It is Sacnoth," then screamed and fled away. And 2 by 2, all up the double line, footman to footman repeated, "It is Sacnoth," and then screamed and fled, till the last 2 gave the message to the table, and all the rest had gone. Hardly then arose the queens and princes, and all fled out of the chamber. And the goodly table, when they were all gone, looked small and disorderly and awry. And to Leothric, pondering in the desolate chamber by what door he should pass outwards, there came from far away the sounds of music, and he knew that it was the magical musicians playing to Ghaznad while he slept. Then Leothric, walking towards the distant music, passed out by the door opposite to the one through which he had cloven his entrance, and so passed into a chamber vast as the other, in which were many women, weirdly beautiful, and they all asked him of his quest. And when they heard that he was to slay Ghaznad, they all besought him to tarry among them, saying that Ghaznad was immortal, save for Sacnoth, and also that they had need of a knight to protect them from the wolves that rushed round and round on the wainscot all night, and sometimes broke in upon them through the mouldering oak. Perhaps Leothric had been tempted to tarry, had they been human women, for theirs was a strange beauty, but he perceived that instead of their eyes they had little flames that flickered in their sockets, and knew them to be the fevered dreams of Ghaznad. Therefore he said, "I have a business with Ghaznad and with Sacnoth," and passed on through the chamber. and at the name Sacnoth those women screamed, and the flames of their eyes sank low and dwindled to sparks. And Leothric left them, and, hewing with Sacnoth, passed through the further door. Outside he felt the night air on his face, and found that he stood upon a narrow way between the two abysses. To the left and right of him, as far as he could see, the walls of the fortress ended in a profound precipice, though the roof still stretched above him, and before him lay two abysses full of stars, for they cut their way through the whole earth and revealed the under-sky. And threading its course between them went the way, and it sloped upward, and its sides were sheer. And beyond the abysses, where the way led up to the further chambers of the fortress, Leothric heard the musicians playing their magical tune. So he stepped onto the way, which was scarcely a stride in width, and moved along it, holding Sacnoth naked. And to and fro beneath him in each abyss whirred the wings of vampires, passing up and down, all giving praise to Satan as they flew. Presently he perceived the dragon Thok lying upon the way, pretending to sleep, and his tail hung down into one of the abysses. And Leothric went toward him, and when he was quite close, Thok rushed at Leothric, and he smote deep with Sacnoth, and Thok tumbled into the abyss, screaming, and his limbs made a whirring in the darkness as he fell, and he fell till his scream sounded no longer than a whistle, and then could be heard no more. Once or twice Leothric saw a star blink for an instant and reappear again, and this momentary eclipse of a few stars was all that remained in the world of the body of Thok. And Lunk, the brother of Thok, who had lain a little behind him, saw that this must be Sacnoth, and fled, lumbering away. And all the while that he walked between the abysses, the mighty vault of the roof of the fortress still screeched over Leothric's head, all filled with gloom. Now when the further side of the abyss came into view, Leothric saw a chamber that opened with innumerable arches upon the twin abysses, and the pillars of the arches went away into the distance and vanished in the gloom to the left and right. Far down the dim precipice on which the pillars stood, he could see windows small and closely barred, and between the bars there showed at moments and disappeared again things that I shall not speak of. There was no light here except for the great southern stars that shone below the abysses, and here and there in the chamber through the arches, lights that moved furtively without the sound of footfall. Then Leothric stepped from the way and entered the great chamber. Even to himself he seemed but a tiny dwarf as he walked under one of those colossal arches. The last faint light of evening flickered through a window painted in somber colours, commemorating the achievements of Satan upon earth. High up in the wall the window stood, and the streaming lights of candles lower down moved stealthily away. Other light there was none, save for a faint blue glow from the steel eye of Tharagarvarug that peered restlessly about it from the hilt of Sacnoth. Heavily in the chamber hung the clammy odour of a large and deadly beast. Leothric moved forward slowly with the blade of Sacnoth in front of him, feeling for the foe, and the eye of the hilt of it looking out behind. Nothing stirred. If anything lurked behind the pillars of the colonnade that held aloft the roof, it neither breathed nor moved. The music of the magical musicians sounded from very near. Suddenly the great doors at the far side of the chamber opened to left and right. For some moments Leothric saw nothing move and waited, clutching Sacnoth. Then one Bondrok came toward him breathing. This was the last and faithfulest guard of Ghaznag, and came from slobbering just now his master's hand. More as a child than a dragon was Ghaznag wont to treat him, giving him often in his fingers tender pieces of man all smoking from his table. Long and low was long Bondrok, and subtle about the eyes, and he came breathing malice against Leothric out of his faithful breast, and behind him roared the armoury of his tail, as when sailors drag the cable of the anchor all rattling down the deck. And well one Bondurok knew that he now faced Sacnoth, for it had been his wont to prophesy quietly to himself for many years as he lay curled at the feet of Gaznak. And Leothric stepped forward into the blast of his breath and lifted Sacnoth to strike. But when Sacnoth was lifted up, the eye of Tharagavarug in the butt of the hilt beheld the dragon and perceived his subtlety. For he opened his mouth wide and revealed to Leothric the ranks of the saber teeth, and the leather gums flapped upward. But while Leothric made to smite at his head, he shot forward scorpion-wise over his head, the length of his armoured tail. All this the eye perceived in the hilt of Sacnoth, who smote suddenly sideways. Not with the edge smote Sacnoth, for, had he done so, the severed end of the tail had still come hurtling on, as some pine tree that the avalanche had hurled point foremost from the cliff right through the broad breast of some mountaineer. So had Leothric been transfixed, but Sacnoth smote sideways with the flat of his blade, and sent the tail whizzing over Leothric's left shoulder, and it rasped upon his armour as it went, and left a groove upon it. Sideways then at Leothric smote the foiled tail of Wong Bongjurog, and Sacnoth parried, and the tail went shrieking up the blade and over Leothric's head. Then Leothric and Wong Bongjurog fought sword to tooth, and the sword smote as only Sacnoth can, and the evil faithful life of Wong Bongjurog, the dragon, went out through the wide wound. Then Leothric walked on past the dead monster, and the armoured body still quivered a little, and for a while it was like all the ploughshares in a country working together in one field behind tired and struggling horses. Then the quivering ceased, and Wong Bongjurog lay still to rust. And Leothric went on to the open gates, and Sacnoth dripped quietly along the floor. By the open gates through which Wong Bongjurog had entered, Leothric came into a corridor echoing with music. This was the first place from which Leothric could see anything above his head, for hitherto the roof had ascended to mountainous heights, and had stretched indistinct in the gloom. But along the narrow corridor hung huge bells low and near to his head, and the width of each brazen bell was from wall to wall, and they were one behind the other. And as he passed under each, the bell uttered, and its voice was mournful and deep, like to the voice of a bell speaking to a man for the last time when he is newly dead. Each bell uttered once as Leothric came under it, and their voices sounded solemnly and wide apart at ceremonious intervals. For if he walked slow, these bells came closer together, and when he walked swiftly they moved further apart, and the echoes of each bell tolling above his head went on before him, whispering to the others. Once when he stopped, they all jangled angrily until he went on again. Between these slow and boding notes came the sound of the magical musicians. They were playing a dirge now very mournfully. And at last Leothric came to the end of the corridor of the bells, and beheld there a small black door, and all the corridor behind him was full of the echoes of the tolling, and they all muttered to one another about the ceremony, and the dirge of the musicians came floating softly through them like the procession of foreign elaborate guests, and all of them boded ill to Leothric. The black door opened at once to the hand of Leothric, and he found himself in the open air in a wide court paved with marble. High over it shone the moon, summoned there by the hand of Gaznak. There Gaznak slept, and around him sat his magical musicians, all playing upon the strings, and even sleeping. Gaznak was clad in armour, and only his wrists and face and neck were bare. But the marvel of that place was the dreams of Gaznak, for beyond the wide court slept a dark abyss, and into the abyss there poured a white cascade of marble stairways, and widened out below into terraces and balconies with fair white statues on them, and descended again in a wide stairway, and came to lower terraces in the dark, where sword uncertain shapes went to and fro. All these were the dreams of Gaznak, and issued from his mind, and, becoming gleaming marble, passed over the edge of the abyss as the musicians played. And all the while out of the mind of Gaznak, lulled by that strange music, went spires and pinnacles beautiful and slender, ever ascending skyward, and the marble dreams moved slow in time to the music. When the bells tolled and the musicians played their dirge, ugly gargoyles came suddenly all over the spires and pinnacles, and great shadows passed swiftly down the steps and terraces, and there was hurried whispering in the abyss. When Leothric stepped from the black door, Gaznak opened his eyes. He looked neither to the left nor right, but stood up at once, facing Leothric. Then the musicians played the death spell on their strings, and there arose a humming along the blade of Sacnoth as he turned the spell aside. When Leothric dropped not down, and they heard the humming of Sacnoth, the musicians arose and fled, all wailing as they went upon their strings. Then Gaznak drew out, screaming from his sheath, the sword that was the mightiest in the world, except for Sacnoth, and slowly walked towards Leothric. And he smiled as he walked, although his own dreams had foretold his doom. And when Leothric and Gaznak came together, each looked at each, and neither spoke a word, but they smote both at once, and their swords met, and each sword knew the other, and from whence he came. And whenever the sword of Gaznak smote on the blade of Sacnoth, it rebounded gleaming as hail from off-slated roofs. But whenever it fell upon the armour of Leothric, it stripped it off in sheets. And upon Gaznak's armour Sacnoth fell oft and furiously, but ever he came back snarling, leaving no mark behind. And as Raznak fought, he held his left hand hovering close over his head. Presently Leothric smote fair and fiercely at his enemy's neck, but Gaznak, clutching his own head by the hair, lifted it high aloft, and Sacnoth went cleaving through an empty space, when Gaznak replaced his head upon his neck, and all the while fought nimbly with the sword. And again Leothric swept with Sacnoth at Gaznak's bearded neck, and ever the left hand of Gaznak was quicker than the stroke, and the head went up, and the sword rushed vainly under it. And the ringing fight went on until Leothric's armour lay all around him on the floor, and the marble was splashed with his blood, and the sword of Gaznak was notched like a saw from meeting the blade of Sacnoth. Still Gaznak stood unwounded and smiling still. At last Leothric looked at the throat of Gaznak and aimed with Sacnoth, and again Gaznak lifted his head by the hair. But not at his throat flew Sacnoth, for Leothric struck instead at the lifted hand, and through the wrist of it went Sacnoth whirring, as a scythe goes through the stem of a single flower. And bleeding, the severed hand fell to the floor, and at once blood spurted from the shoulder of Gaznak, and dripped from the fallen head. And the tall pinnacles went down into the earth, and the wide fair terraces all rolled away, and the court was gone like the dew. And a wind came, and the colonnade drifted thence, and all the colossal halls of Gaznak fell, and the abysses closed up suddenly, as the mouth of a man who, having told a tale, will forever speak no more. Then Leothric looked about him in the marshes where the night mist was passing away, and there was no fortress, nor sound of dragon or mortal. Only beside him lay an old man, wizened and evil and dead, whose head and hand were severed from his body. And gradually over the wide lands the dawn was coming up, and ever growing in beauty as it came, like to the peal of an organ played by a master's hand, growing louder and lovelier as the soul of the masters warms, and at last giving praise with all its mighty voice. Then the birds sang, and Leothric went homeward, and left the marshes, and came to the dark wood, and the light of the dawn ascending lit him upon his way. And into Alathurion he came ere noon, and with him brought the evil wizened head, and the people rejoiced, and the nights of trouble ceased. This is the tale of the vanquishing of the Fortress Unvanquishable, save for Sacnoth, and of his passing away, as it is told and believed by those who love the mystic days of old. Others have said, and vainly claim to prove, that a fever came to Alathurian and went away, and that this same fever drove Leothric into the marshes by night and made him dream there and act violently with the sword. And others again say that there hath been no town of Alathurian, and that Leothric never lived. Peace to them. The gardener hath gathered up the autumn's leaves. Who shall see them again, or who want of them? And who shall say what hath befallen in the days long ago? Good story. Bit of feedback on my side, just to ramble. I mean, this is written in the early 1900s, and you can tell where that real old school Dungeons and Dragons fantasy kind of, video game aesthetic comes from, where opening the next dungeon door can reveal literally anything. Illusions, endless pits, entire armies in a single room, to talk about fantastical. This story is incredibly fantastical, quite a lot of subtle and dark images, references to Satan, and the ending quite ambiguous. Did everyone go crazy, and did this young man murder an old person? Well, thank you for listening, and again, if you enjoyed this, let me know what story in the public domain you'd like to hear me read. Tell me if I'm being too quiet. I am putting on a bit of a quiet voice, maybe to help those who want to sleep. But I'm also happy to do one or two stories with a bit more drama and life. If I'm too quiet, too muffled, if you want a bit more vigor, or if you like what you hear, and and if I add music, if it's enjoyable, if it doesn't work, your comments are really helpful, and safe travels.